This evening, Nels Hoffman presents the second of his two very interesting talks going back to the beginnings of modern Europe. The title of his talk tonight is How Christianity Laid the Foundation for Modern Science and Many Other Things Such as Human Rights and Individual Freedom. Part 2, The Work of the Church. Here's a short bio on Nels. Nels Hoffman is a physicist working at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the Plasma Theory and Applications Group of the Computational Physics Division. He earned a BA in physics from Rice University in 1970 and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Wisconsin in 1974. His research interests currently include ion transport in plasmas and data science applied to laser-driven fusion experiments. He is a founding member and past president of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum and is a member of the First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos. He enjoys exploring the ways that science and religion can work together to enhance our understanding of the universe, as well as the reality that transcends the universe. He hopes that his talk tonight will help more people realize that, although we live in an increasingly secular age, who we are and how we think has been profoundly shaped by religion. Okay, let's get started now. I'll turn this over to Nels there, and we'll monitor the questions and comments as they come in on chat. I hope you enjoy the talk. All right, Nels.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan said, the title of my talk tonight is How Christianity Laid the Foundation for Modern Science and Many Other Things. And this is part 2 of the presentation. I hope you were able to see part 1 last week. But part 2 tonight, I've titled The Work of the Church. And it's going to be a description of what the Western Church did in Europe beginning about 500 AD or 500 CE, as we call it, 500 of the Common Era. And so here's where we left things last week. I showed you evidence that around the year 500, the cultural institutions of Europeans were similar to those of most other human ethno-linguistic groups. And that means other groups at the time, but also most human ethno-linguistic groups today, the various societies that we find around the globe. And this fact that the institutions were similar to those of other groups is evidence that the psychology of these ancient Europeans was also similar to the psychology of other groups. And last week, you may remember, I presented Henrich's argument as to why that would be the case. So we can use the institutions to give us insight into psychology. Now, last week, we also looked at evidence that the psychology of Western Europeans today is quite different from other ethno-linguistic groups. And Henrich calls it weird psychology, weird standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So weird nations, we happen to live in one. People by and large have this quite different psychology compared to that of other ethno-linguistic groups. We are, as a group, highly individualistic, self-obsessed, control-oriented, nonconformist, guilt-ridden, and analytical, and a number of other things as well, which Henrich details. Last week, we also saw that Europe, even as late as the year 1000, was culturally stagnant, economically undeveloped, and geopolitically passive, in the words of one historian. In other words, not much was going on in an exterior sense in Europe at that time, although under the hood, of course, important psychological changes were going on, and the Western Church was doing important work, as we will see tonight. One thing that had been happening as early as the year 800 is that Christianity was producing an expanding amount of literacy in Europe, and also an appreciation for the book of nature, so-called, the idea that we can look at nature and learn something about God in the process. This will be an important idea as we start to look at the origin, at the foundation for modern science. Now, this all raised some questions last week as we discussed. For example, why is it that Western European weird psychology today is so different from that of almost all other ethno-linguistic groups? When and how did this psychology originate? And when and how did Europe emerge from its underdeveloped state around the year 1000? Well, it turns out that the answers to these questions are related, according to Joseph Henrich, who is the author of this book that I have used as my primary reference. Joseph Henrich he is the chair of the Department of Human Evolution at Harvard University. And the book he has written, titled The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous, is the primary source that I'm appealing to for tonight's presentation. So we'll look at the answers to these questions and some of the consequences of the explanation that Henrich advances. Now, here is Henrich's central thesis. It's that the Western Church changed European psychology through its rules about marriage. These rules caused the destruction of the tribes and clans of Europe. These changes to the kinship patterns that had formerly bound together people in these clans and tribes, the fact that these patterns were changing then required new social structures and new psychology. Now, nobody knew this would happen. No, the church leaders who were advancing these rules about marriage didn't know what the consequences would be. And so no one planned this. No one planned that the psychology of Europeans would change. But we will follow the evidence that this is what happened. Now, the new social and cultural phenomena that arose as a result of the changing psychology include processes such as urban growth, the rapid growth of cities, impersonal trade, the idea that you could carry on trade with people you don't know and could trust them, legal systems, voluntary associations like trade guilds and universities. And we'll look at some of these social and cultural phenomena. All right, now what is Henrich talking about as far as the church's rules about marriage? He calls it the church's marriage and family program, or the MFP. These rules about marriage. What were these rules? Well, there were a variety of rules designed to prevent incest, but the church defined incest ever more broadly, beginning in about the 5th century. They prohibited marriage to blood relatives, including cousins, and eventually all the way out to 6 cousins, although that didn't stick for more than a century or two, and they relaxed it to 4th cousins. They prohibited marriage to in-laws. They prohibited polygynous marriage, so no secondary wives, no sex slaves, no public brothels. They prohibited marriage to non-Christians unless they converted to Christianity. They created this institution called spiritual kinship, that is godparents. And of course, you can't marry your godparents. They discouraged adoption. They required public consent to marriage by both the bride and the groom. So this tended to interfere with prearranged marriages. The reason the bride and the groom have to say, "I do" in public is to signify that they both consent to the marriage. The church encouraged neo-local residents of newlyweds. That means not patrilocal. Patrilocal residence means that the newlyweds go off to live with the groom's father. Matrilocal would be that they go off to live with the bride's mother. But neolocal means that they live independently. Patrilocal residence had been the pattern in Europe. Church also encouraged individual ownership of land and inheritance by testament. In other words, your clan didn't decide who got your stuff when you died. You got to decide that. Now, some of these rules resemble the incest laws of Leviticus 18. If you've read Leviticus 18 lately, you know that it's a prohibition of a variety of kinds of incest. For example, you can't marry your cousin, you can't marry your uncle, you can't marry your aunt, and of course, no sexual relations are permitted among close family members. But interestingly, Leviticus 18 does not prohibit cousin marriage. And yet the church, beginning about the 5th century, as they say, strongly prohibited cousin marriage. Now, Roman law sometimes banned cousin marriage, and so you get the feeling that the church was combining the Levitical law with Roman customs. And by the way, this thesis that the Western Church changed European psychology through the marriage and family program is actually due to British social anthropologist Sir Jack Goody. And Henrich gives Goody the credit for originating this idea. Okay, so here's the sort of causal chain that Henrich is proposing. The church creates its marriage and family program bit by bit and piece by piece. It was not a unified program originally, so this is a bit of a misnomer to call it a program. It was a piecemeal kind of set of rules. But then the MFP had the effect of reducing something called kinship intensity. And kinship intensity is a metric that Henrich defines, and it combines other metrics involving cousin marriage, nuclear families, bilateral inheritance. That is, do you trace your heritage through just your father's line, as many clans did, the amount of neolocal residence, polygyny, things like that. The stronger the kinship intensity is, the more clan-like and tribe-like is your society. The weaker kinship intensity is, the more like modern marriage patterns your society is. So the MFP reduces kinship intensity. The reduced kinship intensity shifts psychology. And then the new weird psychology leads to new social institutions. So we're going to follow this causal chain. And by the way, there's feedback. You remember the beaver in the dam. There's always feedback between the social institutions and psychology. So keep that in mind. Now, Henrich and his co-workers take great pains to examine many other possible factors that can affect psychology and social institutions and kinship intensity. And these include factors relating to agriculture, food productivity, the terrain ruggedness, latitude of the society they're examining. Disease, various things related to disease, and religiosity, just the amount of religious practice going on, and colonization, the experience of European colonization. Now, these factors do play a role. It's not as if there is no effect of, say, disease, let's say, on psychology or social structures. But Henrich and coworkers always found that the MFP dosage, viewing the MFP as kind of as a medicine, let's say, the stronger the MFP dosage, the stronger the effect on psychology and social institutions in their research. So the MFP doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. And in fact, it is the most powerful explanatory factor in Henrich's work. All right, let's look at the church's MFP. Now, In Henrich's book, he's got 4 pages of these edicts that came out of various Christian synods, actually beginning in the year 305. Okay, so every 10 years or so, there's another synod and another rule about marriage. So look at this, in the year 506, now we're in the 6th century after the birth of Christ. The Synod of Agde in France prohibits first and second cousin marriage and marriage to a brother's widow, wife's sister, stepmother, uncle's widow, etc. These are defined as incest, so don't do it. The year 596, the Frankish king, Childebert II, decrees the death penalty for marriage to one's stepmother. Okay, this is not some kind of overarching policy or theoretical unified construct here. This is a patchwork of various rules put in place. In this case, the king is all for it, but he leaves the punishment of other incest violations to the bishops. If the convicted resist the church's punishment, then their property will be seized and redistributed to the relatives. And this, of course, creates an incentive to report violators. Here's another one. In the year 721, a synod in Rome prohibits marriage to one's brother's wife, niece, grandchild, stepmother, stepdaughter, and on, all kinfolk, including anyone ever married to any blood relative. The Pope specifies that for missionary purposes, that is, if you're out among the pagans trying to convert them, you can relax these prohibitions just up to the first cousin. But so there are exceptions. What do you conclude from this list that goes on and on and on until, oh gosh, the 13th century? Well, these edicts must have been frequently ignored, right? Apparently, because the church had to keep harping on them again and again. And after all, the church had no secular power, only moral and spiritual power, for example, excommunication. But when you could get the king on your side, as for King Childebert II here, who decreed the death penalty, that obviously put some teeth into the edict, but that didn't always happen. And obviously, sometimes the royalty fought back. I mean, as you are probably well aware, the nobility of Europe kept on marrying their cousins right up into the 20th century. So nobility got away with things that the common people could not get away with. All right, do we know that the MFP was actually having any effect? Well, we don't have demographic data, back in the year 500 or even the year 1000, but by the end of the Middle Ages, so let's say the year 1350, there's enough demographic data to start to see that something called the European marriage pattern was beginning to emerge. And what you see then is more monogamous nuclear families with neolocal residents, less likely to live with the parents, later marriage delayed into the mid-20s. Many women never marry. 15 to 25% of Northwestern European women remained unmarried at age 30. The church, of course, provided a respectable alternative to marriage as nuns for women. Families were smaller. By modern standards, families were still large, but relatively speaking, they became smaller and fertility was reduced. And there was more commonly something called the premarital labor period, meaning that young people moved out of the house to go work in the homes of somebody they were not related to prior to getting married, and this led to a delay in marriage. It's a phenomenon that is actually not found in many other cultures. But when your families are smaller, you don't have as many children, well, you're going to need some servants. And so this increased the pressure to hire young people that are perhaps not related to you. Here's another interesting thing that we observe in language. Many languages have kinship terminology that is peculiar to kinship intensive societies. in kinship intensive societies, it might be common to marry some cousins, but not other cousins. It's okay, in fact, it's preferred to marry certain cousins. And so you have to have special words to distinguish between your mother's brother and your father's brother, or in particular, your father's brother's son and your mother's brother's son. Those are, you don't use the same word. We call them cousins, but in these other languages, you don't, because one is marriageable for you and the other is not. And what we find is that European languages gradually lost these terms. In 700 CE for the Romance languages, a little later for the Germanic languages, and as late as the 17th century for remote parts of Scotland. Now, Henrich points out that these words typically hang around in the language for, 1 or 2 centuries after the kinship intensity diminishes so that cousins are no longer marriageable. But so that lets you perhaps identify when these marriage practices finally began to change in these various parts of Europe. And then finally, we see that the church's decrees about marriage finally begin to taper off about the year 1215. So the church no longer has to harp on what is incest and what is not incest. It's as if these concepts by this time have become embedded in the psychology of Europeans after what, 700 to 900 years of stressing it over and over and over. All right, well, so why would these particular marriage rules spell doom for the clans and tribes of Europe? Well, less cousin marriage means the clan wealth, which would be carried away in the form of a dowry or a bride price. When people get married, the bride and groom bring money to the table. If you're not allowed to marry within your clan, those cousins, and this ban on marrying in-laws means you can't even marry into that clan that your sister just married into because they're your in-laws now. So this weakens the ties among clans and makes it more likely you'll marry somebody who lives a long distance away, and then your dowry goes off with you to that long distance person. And this is going to reduce the influence of the clan hierarchy, especially now if your residence following marriage is neo-local rather than patrilocal. You don't have your parents standing over your head telling you what to do and how many children to have and so forth. In fact, many European dynasties died out. The ban on polygyny, for example, reduced the number of heirs. When marriages were declared illegitimate because it was a marriage to a cousin or an in-law, well, those heirs were illegitimate, and they could not inherit. And then, of course, after divorce, remarriage was forbidden, unless the first marriage could be annulled, which would usually cost you something. So for a variety of reasons, then, the clans and tribes dwindled in their influence. So then, what we see is the next step in this causal chain is a shift in psychology. Now, Henrich and his co-workers defined several ways of measuring the intensity of kin-based institutions. I referred to this kinship intensity index already. And he then goes on to demonstrate that kin-based institutions affect and are affected by psychology around the world today. We made this argument last week. You remember the beaver and the dam. And so Henrich goes on to do this with a lot of data. And it depends on this interesting thing. You may not have been aware, I certainly wasn't, that the frequency of cousin marriage varies widely around the globe. Some countries show a particularly high proportion of cousin marriages, indicating high kinship intensity. So this map here of the world shows cousin marriage rates. And this is the rate of marriage between second cousins and closer relatives around the world. Um, countries that are shown by the cross-hatched shading, we have no data for, okay? So no data for Russia or much of Africa. But the rest of the world, when you see white here, that means less than 1% cousin marriage. So in the United States, France, Germany, England, Norway, Sweden, hardly anybody marries their cousin, their first or second cousin. But you go over here to Sudan or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Afghanistan, the rate of cousin marriage is very high, 40%, but greater than 50%. In India, not quite so high, maybe 10 to 20%. Latin America down maybe around 1 to 10%. China, likewise. But this is an interesting metric now of kinship intensity and the importance of family, clan, and tribe. And by family, I don't mean nuclear family, mom and dad and the kids. I mean the big family, all those relatives, cousins and cousins. Well, you might not have thought cousin marriage matters all that much, but take a look at this. Even in modern Europe, cousin marriage is correlated with other societal patterns, as you see in this figure. Here's a map of Italy, and we're looking at the fraction of first cousin marriage over here on the left-hand side. So in northern Italy, cousin marriage is rather low, less than 1/3% in much of northern Italy. But you get down into southern Italy, and the fraction of cousin marriage goes up to more than 3.5%. And by the way, this is first cousin marriage. Greater than 3.5%. Down in Sicily, likewise, Sardinia, somewhat high too, also like southern Italy. Now here in the middle, we're looking at voter turnout, and this is data from 1960 to 1964. Voter turnout is quite high in northern Italy, but it drops off in southern Italy to even less than 68% compared to 86% and more in northern Italy. It's the same places where the cousin marriage rate is high. Voting is apparently not as important to people. Right-hand side, we're looking at judicial inefficiency. Okay, this is the number of years that a trial takes. So it's something about the efficiency of the court system, which perhaps relates to people's trust in courts or the seriousness of the judicial process. And again, you see this kind of correlation where trials take quite a long time down here in southern Italy, whereas in most of northern Italy, they go faster, but not everywhere, but still, you see this kind of correlation. Okay, well, you could go on and on with this kind of thing, and Henrich does. I'll just show you one of his plots that shows that kinship intensity is correlated with much greater trust of your in-group than your out-group. Now, everybody trusts their in-group more than their out-group. And by in-group, we mean your family, your neighbors, and people you know, people who belong to the same religion that you do, and so forth. The out-group, well, that's everybody else. That's them, people you've just met, foreigners, adherents of other religions. So this is kind of like us versus them. And the point here is that higher kinship intensity or cousin marriage does about as well. The more cousin marriage there is, the less people trust their out group than their in group. Here in the USA, everybody trusts us more than them, but here in USA, we don't make so big a distinction as they do in places with lots of cousin marriage. Now, cousin marriage doesn't explain all the variation here, okay? There's some reason that in Bahrain, there's a lot of trust, even though they have a lot of cousin marriage. Who knows what that is? That would take another study. But you look at the bulk of societies here, and the correlation is very strong. All right, continue on now. Let's look at the next step in Henrich's causal change. Europe's psychology is changing because their kinship intensity is changing, and so there are new social institutions that arise as a result. Why is that? Well, changes in these patterns means that the kin-based institutions are no longer able to organize production, provide security, or indeed provide identity to tell you who you are. So individuals then were socially compelled and personally motivated to relocate, to seek out like-minded others, to form voluntary associations, to find other people that would help them be secure, help them achieve their social purposes, interact with, interacting with strangers then became not just feasible, but almost mandatory. The result is that more people moved to the cities and the cities grew in size, and that new associations such as monasteries, trade guilds, universities, corporations, and charter towns proliferated and competed with one another. Medieval guilds were an interesting phenomenon. They are associations of artisans established to defend their common rights and interests. And we'll say more about rights because this concept of rights began to emerge at this time. Guilds were authorized by the king to govern themselves, basically. These were self-governing organizations and were representative democracies on a very small scale, of course. Members enjoyed particular privileges. It's a book of trades in Paris, written 1268, listed 100 different guilds, all imaginable trades and occupations here. They had this right to assemble and freely discuss their general interests, this important idea of self-governance. Now, universities developed as guilds of professors or guilds of students. The first universities show up in Italy, France, Spain, England in the late 11th and 12th centuries, and they are studying a unified kind of curriculum. They evolved from those cathedral schools that we discussed last week that had established a curriculum, a unified curriculum, the same curriculum all across Europe. The earliest were in Italy here, France, Oxford, England. Coincidentally, there was a widespread, or maybe not coincidentally, there was a widespread reintroduction of Greek thinkers, including Aristotle, coming from Arabic translations of the original Greek. And Aristotle wound up on the curriculum, not just on the curriculum, but at the center of the curriculum of all these proliferating European universities. Universities were internally regulated, self-governing, and protected from external intervention, at least by the local rulers, the local hierarchy. A papal bull of April 1231 guaranteed the University of Paris independence from the local secular or church authority. That included the Bishop of Paris. That's because the university was directly under papal patronage. But when the Pope is several thousand miles away, effectively, this means you have a lot of independence. So the universities thrived then in this fairly independent atmosphere. Well, what about science? We're looking for the foundation of modern science. And we've been looking at psychological and social history, but let's shift gears now to look at philosophical developments, because science is going to emerge from these important philosophical developments. Now, just to recap here, Christianity and the church have brought together these crucial elements of modern science. There's this new weird psychology. It's analytical and abstract. It emphasizes universal principles, and it's highly individualistic. Now, this psychology rests on this undergirding kind of Europe-wide substrate of literacy that's more widespread than it had been, at any rate, still not perhaps extremely high. There was this cultural religious unity, and we discussed this last week, how the church provided one uniform language, namely Latin, that enabled people from England and Germany and Italy all to converse. And it provided a certain amount of independence from the state, as we just saw for the University of Paris. The Roman law provided some background for these fictitious legal personalities, such as universities. Jewish theology, as we discussed last week, gave a basis for believing that the universe was good and lawful and intelligible. Now, we haven't talked much about Greek philosophy, but we're going to. And it's going to provide a basis for the importance of reason, causality, and universal principles. And we will see then that this gives a foundation from which modern science can emerge. Okay, now so what's going on here at the universities is that new and better translations of Greek thinkers are becoming available. Islamic thinkers and translators had access to these Greek philosophers for several centuries. And so now good Latin translations were being made from the Arabic versions, and there were important Arabic commentators such as Averroes and Avicenna that helped increase the interest in the Greek philosophers within Europe. Aristotle was very influential. He wrote about everything. You couldn't ignore Aristotle if you were a serious thinker, because he covered all human knowledge. Encyclopedia Britannica called him the first genuine scientist in history. And of course, we're talking about 330 BCE in the case of Aristotle. Euclid's Elements were a profound demonstration of the power of human reason and an important part of the curriculum of European universities. Now, here's the thing, and it's important for the emergence of modern science. Aristotle posed a huge problem for Christians in the 13th century. Now, you've heard of Darwin, you've heard of Copernicus, and you know the problems for Christianity posed by Darwin's theory of evolution and Copernicus's theory of a heliocentric solar system. But were you aware that Aristotle was a big problem in the 13th century? So, as I mentioned, he covered all knowledge. He emphasized this concept of causality, extremely important for modern science eventually, universal principles, logic and reason. But here's the problem. Christians in Europe had created these autonomous institutions called universities, sort of a powder keg, and then they tossed this spark of Aristotle's philosophy into this powder keg of higher learning called universities. And the problem is that Aristotle directly challenged and contradicted many aspects of traditional Christian worldview. Aristotle said the universe was infinitely old. This directly contradicts Genesis. Aristotle's universe is governed by a God, but that God is not the creator of the universe. And Aristotle's universe has no immortal souls. The soul is nothing more than the aspect of a organic body that allows it to live. And there is no divine grace in Aristotle's universe. Well, did this matter? You bet it mattered. Early on, Islamic thinkers rejected Aristotle and causality. So a very influential Islamic thinker, Al-Ghazali, in the late 11th, early 12th century, vehemently rejected Aristotle and Plato, and he propounded an idea called theological occasionalism. Occasional here does not mean occasional in the sense that you and I typically use it, like every now and then. Occasionalism means that every event in the universe is an occasion for Allah, God, to demonstrate his power. And he may choose to link events in a way that we could regard as cause and effect, or he may choose not to. And this idea of causality then was viewed as a limitation on Allah's power. Al-Ghazali writes that the connection between what is usually believed to be a cause and what is believed to be an effect is not a necessary connection, because God has the ability to create satiety without eating and death without decapitation, or to let life persist notwithstanding decapitation. In other words, you can cut somebody's head off and the body might still live if it's Allah's will for that to happen. So Al-Ghazali rejected causality. These later commentators like Averroes and Avicenna, Averroes wrote a rebuttal. But the course of Islamic thought had been set. Now, it's not clear whether Islamic thought was influenced and set in its course by Al-Ghazali, or whether Al-Ghazali was merely writing down a point of view that was widely accepted at the time. Be that as it may, Islamic thinkers had to contend with this rejection of Aristotelian causality. So, did that matter? Well, it was quite different in Europe because of Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, Albertus Magnus. Aquinas showed that Aristotle's philosophy was compatible with, maybe even supported by, Scripture. Aquinas studied and taught at the University of Paris, and his teacher, Albertus Magnus, considered it very important to reconcile Aristotle with Christian thinking. Albertus Magnus evidently did not succeed himself in doing so, and we give Aquinas the credit for having done so. He blended Greek philosophy and Christian doctrine, showed that rational thinking was crucial, was a valid way of understanding truths of God, and that God reveals himself through nature, the book of nature. So to study nature is to study God. Reason and revelation could not conflict because they both come from God. So Thomas succeeded in incorporating the philosophy of Aristotle in the Christian West. What if he had failed? What if no one had succeeded in doing this? Would Western Christendom have gone the route of Islam in rejecting causality with whatever consequences followed from that? We don't know. But Thomas Aquinas was very important for this kind of thing. Now, we don't have time to track down a lot of Aquinas' thought, but here's just one example. He had a novel viewpoint about the eternity of the world. This is the concept that the universe is infinitely old, okay? This Aristotelian notion that directly seems to violate Genesis chapter 1. Well, many philosophers had written one way or another for or against the eternity of the world. Aquinas took a different approach than his predecessors. He claimed that you can't tell whether the world is eternal or not eternal just by logical argument alone. Okay, Euclid was so seductive in convincing people that you could just think about things like geometrical objects and figure out what's true and what's not true. But Thomas was savvy enough to realize that this way of proceeding is not adequate for nature, for the vast complexity and diversity of the natural world. So you have to rely on something else. And in the case of Thomas, he said, we have to rely on revelation. And Genesis tells us that the universe is not infinitely old. It was created at a definite point in time. Today, we would say, well, you have to gather more data. And for Aquinas, that data was revelation. But Thomas went on to say that even if the universe is infinitely old, let's say it is infinitely old, well, God could be an instantaneous and motionless creator and could have created the world anyway without preceding it along the time axis. If there was no time axis, he couldn't have preceded it in time, but he could be an instantaneous and motionless creator outside of four-dimensional space-time. So Aquinas infers that God could be outside of 4D space-time. And this is 650 years before Einstein. I think that's a pretty good conceptual leap for Aquinas to have made. Anyway, well, much more was going on during the High Middle Ages. The Crusades, which reopened the Mediterranean to trade and travel, the Crusades were very bad for the Middle East and for everybody between Europe and the Middle East, especially Jews and Byzantines, who suffered at the hands of the European military. The Crusades were bad for the European military. Those knights and nobles who left Europe to go over to the Middle East, after the First Crusade, there was just a series of military defeats. Whoever said that history is the polemic of the victor hasn't paid enough attention to the Crusades, where it's the vanquished, namely the European military, who wrote a lot of that history. But they were good for European culture. The idea that you just get these warring, violent nobles out of Europe, go fight somebody else, said the Pope. Go away, go to the Middle East and fight them. Leave Europeans alone for a while. This was good for European culture and opened Europe then to the rest of the world. Travelers began visiting Asia in larger numbers, looking for trade, diplomatic ties against the Muslims, missionary opportunities. These are really interesting travelogues to read. William of Rubruck visiting the Great Khan in the 1250s. Really fascinating stories. The first eyeglasses were made. Here's a contemporary drawing in the year 1400. Mechanical clocks spread rapidly across Europe during this time. The Black Plague was a serious setback to various cultural advances in Europe. In England, the Black Plague was something like suffering 30 World War I's in a single year. That's how many people died in the plague in England compared to the death rate in World War I. But one effect it did have was to increase the value of labor and give more freedom to what had formerly been serfs working on feudal holdings. Capitalism, the almighty pound and shilling began to replace feudalism. Here's something else that began going on. This was pointed out by Ian Mortimer in his book, Millennium, From Religion to Revolution, How Civilization Has Changed Over 1,000 Years. Individualism, as you know, weird people are highly individualistic. It was sometime before the 15th century, we really see it pop up now in the 15th century. Individualism was growing. Mortimer points out that high quality glass mirrors were invented around the year 1300 and spread through Europe by the end of the 14th century. And with a good mirror, what can you do? Well, you can do a lot. One thing you can see is your own unique appearance. And so, as Mortimer says, people began to contemplate their own unique appearance. And we see portrait painting becoming more common throughout the 15th century. Now, this painting by Jan van Eyck, Man in a Turban, might be a self-portrait. It might be the first self-portrait. It might be it's a very early self-portrait in that case. And then we see more and more portraits of other people then becoming more common. Why do art historians think this was a self-portrait? Well, you see how the subject of the portrait is staring directly at the painter. This doesn't happen very much in portraits. The subjects are typically gazing away somewhere, but the way this subject is staring, almost glaring really at the painter, suggests it's a self-portrait. Previously, in earlier times, it was a rare individual who thought of him or herself as unique. People saw themselves as part of a community or a clan or a tribe, of course, as we've discussed. And incidentally, this is why exile, banishment, and excommunication were such severe penalties. To cut someone off from their community was a terrible punishment. But less and less so as people began seeing themselves individualistically. We see more and more autobiographies and personal letters appearing at this time. And in religion, people began to stress their personal relationship to God. And this would culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Well, it didn't even culminate there, of course, individualism. The discovery of the self, you could say, continued to become more and more important well after the Reformation on into the modern era. Privacy became a thing. In earlier centuries, the clans and tribes, householders tend to eat and sleep in the same hall as their servants, as the hired hands. But particularly as the chimney was invented, it began to to be possible to build private chambers, put a chimney in them so you could have a fire and stay warm even in your own room. And so householders began to build larger houses with private rooms for themselves and their guests. Well, with this notion of individualism, we see this concept of rights emerging as individualism and self-governing associations spread. The concept of human rights did not originate as a grand coherent theory. It formed slowly and piece by piece, kind of in the way that the marriage and family program was not a grand coherent theory. It was kind of piecemeal edicts and regulations. In the case of rights, competing voluntary associations like towns and guilds needed to attract members who were becoming more individualistic. So to compete, then you wanted to grant your members more and more rights and privileges. Charter towns do this kind of thing. The church canon lawyers began to develop a formal notion of natural rights by around 1200. The Magna Carta enumerated what later came to be thought of as human rights. The petition of right, I mean, as an American, I didn't know anything about this. I kind of thought Americans invented rights in 1776, but you know, it's not like that. The petition of right declared Englishmen had various rights and liberties. And of course, the theory of rights began to be really thought about by people like John Locke and Thomas Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 17th century. So rights, what are these rights? People began to think about these seriously. Well, can weird psychology go bad? What do we see when weird people go on to encounter other cultures? Weird psychology leads to this development of technology in a way that we have leapt right over. But what we see is that this weird abstract concept called rights was not extended to everybody as European nations came to dominate the earth. We're skipping a lot of history here, but what we do see is that as Europeans spread out over the earth, they tended to regard rights as something that were for them alone and not for anybody who was perhaps not a Christian or didn't look like Europeans or didn't have a culture like Europeans. And the result was imperialism, slavery, racism, which were perhaps the reason and the result of this kind of weird exclusionary possession of rights. We invented rights, and guess what? You don't have any. It took a while for the notion of rights, of universal rights, to become widespread. And the advanced technology that came along with the scientific revolution and industrial revolution then produced various kinds of environmental destruction and indeed global warfare, World War I, World War II, uniquely weird phenomena. And we are continuing to deal, as you are well aware, with the effects of this sad history. Furthermore, even within weird culture, you know, forgetting about the rest of the world, there is this sort of legacy or this current phenomenon of materialism, violence, ressentiment, which is this phenomenon that basically leads to, let's call it conspiracy theories. The idea that the reason I'm downtrodden is because of what somebody else is doing to me and I want to get even. Alienation, loneliness, obsession, and mental illness. It's as if the orchestra of Western Europe is attempting to play on even though the conductor has left the podium. The conductor being who? Christianity, perhaps? Or not that the conductor has left the podium, but the conductor has been elbowed off the podium by 4 or 5 other conductors who are all competing for the attention of the horns and the violas and the percussion section. I think this phrase is due to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. People like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, noticed this phenomenon in the 19th century already, that there's some kind of despair going on in Europe, and it's associated with the will to be oneself. Here's this idea of the self with a capital S. And whether you refuse to be yourself or you insist on being yourself in despair, that's the issue. Well, Kierkegaard's a little hard to understand, but he had his finger on something there. Okay, to finish up now with science, we're not going to track down the emergence of modern science. It's clear that the church sometimes opposed the progress of science. Aristotle was a big problem, and this led to something called the condemnation of 1277 by the Bishop of Paris, because Aristotle's ideas conflicted with Scripture. It didn't stick. Atomism, the idea that matter is composed of atoms with vacuum, this seemed too materialistic and deterministic, sort of along the lines of why Islamic thinkers rejected Aristotle. Heliocentrism, the idea that the earth moves and the sun is at the center, this seemed to conflict with Scripture, and it displaced humans from the center of the universe. But you know, the church always harbored numerous competing viewpoints. If somebody in the church thinks X, well, there's always somebody else who thinks Y, Z, and A, and B. Copernicus, or Galileo, even when Galileo first pointed his telescope at the solar system and discovered the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, and the fact that Mars changed in size very, very dramatically as it orbited the sun, the Jesuits loved it. The Jesuits gave a big party for Galileo. And furthermore, if there was church opposition, it never had any effect. It hardly ever had any effect on slowing down the development of science. Now, I've been describing the foundation of modern science, not the actual emergence of modern science itself. And I've tried to show that this foundation, perhaps we can view weird psychology as the mortar that holds together the bricks that make up the foundation of modern science, those big bricks being the ones you see here that we have described. But to go into modern science, well, we'd have to talk about Roger Bacon and his experiments, his empiricism. And we'd have to talk about the Oxford calculators in the 14th century, working out the details of mechanics in a very early way. You know that S equals 1/2 AT squared, where S is displacement and A is acceleration. This was worked out by the Oxford calculators in the 14th century. But the Black Death slowed them down. Modern science, empirical mathematical science, well, it depended on the idea that new knowledge was possible. And we're going to kind of leave it at this, that modern science took off soon after people realized that we can discover new things that the ancients didn't know about. And so new explorations of the islands near Portugal, the discovery of the Canary Islands, the Azores, and then new routes around Africa. This took off with Prince Henry the Navigator in the early 15th century. Of course, Columbus discovered a new world. There was a new Christianity, namely Protestantism, and on, new things, new discoveries, opening new fields and providing new tools. New words appear in all European languages with new definitions and new books with the word new in the title, as outlined by David Wootton in The Invention of Science. These are what really get modern science going. And I just want to conclude here, we're close to the end, with an observation that you see this urgency and dedication, this kind of feverish rush to obtain new knowledge in Europe in a way that was not seen in other cultures. And you start to see this as early as the 12th century in this intellectual gold rush, when European scholars begin to hurry to translate the work of Greek philosophers from Arabic manuscripts. I think you see a prefiguring of the scientific revolution in this 12th century Renaissance, as Arab libraries were being opened to Western eyes in Spain, Sicily, and southern Italy as the Muslims were driven out of these areas. By the way, have you wondered why southern Italy is different from northern Italy? It's because that boundary line between south and north in Italy is the boundary of the Carolingian Empire. That's Charlemagne's empire. The south of Italy was ruled by Muslims and then the Byzantines. And so the marriage and family program never really caught hold there. So there was this intellectual gold rush in the 12th century, the age of discovery in the 15th century, all these new trade routes. Again, there's just this energy behind the discovery of new things. Then, of course, the scientific revolution. It was permeated, in the words of Mark Elvin in this volume on China, on why China never had a scientific revolution or a political revolution. As Vicky Earhart reminded us last week, you need scientific revolution, political revolution, and industrial revolution to really attain modernity. It happened in Europe, but there was this sense that it all mattered, this little remarked sense, in fact, in Mark Elvin's word, this of urgency and seriousness that is not present in other cultures. Now, almost finished here with this talk. Henrich always identifies the church as the actor in this drama. And by the church, he means Western or European or the Roman Catholic Church. Henrich says that the Eastern Orthodox Church did not produce new psychology as much as the Western Church did. Well, he determines this through his research. So he concludes that Christianity was not doing the work because Henrich thinks that the Eastern Orthodox Church has the same Christianity as the Western Church did. Well, I would suggest that in fact, Eastern Orthodoxy differs in important theological ways from Western Christianity, but it would take better scholars than I to really track all that down. But I would suggest that we should expand the investigation to include Christianity in total, not just the marriage and family program, because as we know, Christianity is more than a set of rules about marriage and family. Christian attitudes towards wealth and towards revenge and forgiveness are perhaps capable of having psychological effects if they are stressed by the church, as they certainly were in the case of wealth, as outlined in this book by Peter Brown titled Through the Eye of a Needle, how the view of wealth was changed during the years 350 to 550, earlier than we're talking about. But it identifies how important Christian ideas about wealth were. Okay, we are at the end now, and I simply want to leave you with this thought. Perhaps we can see God in history if we take off our cap of methodological naturalism, which Henrich wears. Henrich, as an anthropologist, sociologist, psychologist, adopts the stance of methodological naturalism, meaning that we are not going to appeal to supernatural phenomena to explain anything. We're going to try to explain everything on the basis of naturalistic phenomena. And Henrich attributes all the processes he's identified as merely the naturalistic working out of what? A theological institution called the church, or he would call it a social institution, a psychological institution. But you and I can take off the methodological naturalistic hat and ask, well, do we see God in any of this? We believe we see God in Revelation. We believe, perhaps, that we see God in nature, that natural theology is a path to learning something about God, although we don't invoke God's hand to explain why my experiment turned out the way it did. That would violate methodological naturalism. but we can see God in nature. And so I ask you, can we see God in history? The Jews certainly thought so. Their scripture tells them how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt. And so I'm asking, can we see God's hand in perhaps the past 2,000 years? Why would the church hammer these rather odd rules about marriage? Certainly not, these are not common rules about marriage, and yet the church hammered them incessantly for almost 1,000 years. Can we see God's hand in that? And in the other rules that arise in Christianity? If so, maybe we can use the term historical theology to apply to seeing God in history the way we call seeing God in nature natural theology. And so I'll leave you with that thought, and I will open it up for questions. Dan.
All right. Nels, thanks for your great talk. And indeed, I think we have some questions in chat. I think, Nels, you're just going to look at the questions. And then I don't think there's that many questions, and then we'll just open it up for a general discussion.
Okay, Vicky Earhart says, cousin marriage gives protection to the girl's women because the man is known to the larger family and likely to live close by, so the rest of the family knows how the girl and women are being treated. Interesting point, Vicky. Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it raises the risk of neo-local residents, the diminishing of the structure, the kinship structures of clan and tribe. There's a risk for women as a result. So, very interesting point. Dan asked, what about the Eastern Church? Did it have similar marriage laws? If so, why did it not lead to the same social developments? Dan, thanks for that question. I'm going to go back to this slide. You see this edict in the year 692 and this in the year 741. These edicts are highlighted they are dark. Mm-hmm. That's because this is the Eastern Church. Oh. So the Eastern Church in the year 1692 and the Byzantine Emperor under the Eastern Church in 741 set forth these edicts. Everything else here, though, is the Western Church. And so this makes the point that the Eastern Church just was not as concerned with these incest prohibitions as the Western Church was. And so, that's what Henrich is saying that the Eastern Church just did not spend as much time. And we don't know how, I don't know how serious the penalties were for, here, the penalty for cousin marriage becomes whipping, okay? There you go. That's no fun, but maybe that's not as serious as having your property seized and redistributed to your relatives. I don't know. But anyway, this is Henrich's point, that the Eastern Church just apparently did not spend as much time on the marriage and family program as the Western Church did. Okay, Vicky Earhart writes, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1650 limits the public role of religion, namely Christianity, after which modern science becomes possible, separates political and religious factors. Religion begins to be a matter of private conscience. Well, Vicky, I would say that separation happened well before that. You're probably speaking of nations in which the Roman Catholic Church was most influential. Protestantism made it possible for much of Europe to basically ignore what the Pope said. Although Galileo was getting in trouble in the early 17th century, that didn't slow down Kepler. Kepler lived up there in Northern Europe, and he didn't care what the Pope said. So when Kepler published his Sidereus Nuncius, I believe it is, the starry messenger, and it included his 3 laws, particularly, his 3 laws were what Isaac Newton used to develop his inverse square law of gravity. So, the horse was out of the barn well before 1650. You may be making the point that greater freedom became possible after 1650, but plenty had already occurred by 1650. I mean, Blaise Pascal was already measuring the weight of the atmosphere. Torricelli had already developed the mercury barometer. The steam engine was just about to get started in a very, very early form by that time. So, I mean, the locomotive was on track by that point.
I point out that Kepler did not publish until after he died. His manuscript was published posthumously precisely because he feared reprisal from the church. And the church is very reluctant, but it's not impossible, but the church is reluctant to condemn someone posthumously for heresy. Kepler knew what he was doing, and he would not publish while he was alive. So to
Okay.
say that he was beyond the reaches, I think not accurate.
Well, okay, thank you. Good point. I stand corrected. However, the fact that he could publish after he died shows that the influence of the church was limited. And whether we would have gotten to the inverse square law a little faster had the church not suppressed his publication is an open question. It took still about, 50 years to get from Kepler's publication to Newton's inverse square law. What role the church played in that isn't clear. I think it's just, it's a bit of a conceptual leap, and Newton had to invent calculus to get there. So a lot of things had to fall in place before the inverse square law. Maury asks, were marriage rules the major distinction for why European sciences flourished and Islam and Chinese did not? Well, Maury, that's the big question. I'm asking that exact question. Was it just the marriage rules alone, or was there more important stuff to Christianity than just the marriage rules that led to this changed European psychology? I think between the marriage rules and the European sciences, you have to insert Henrich's entire causal chain, okay? The marriage rules, and then an arrow leading to the psychology, and then an arrow leading to the new social institutions, and only then do you get to put in the arrow leading to European sciences. So to say, could marriage rules be the major distinction? Well, you've got this whole causal chain that has a lot going on. So
it was more the first step rather than the final path.
Yeah. Maury, I think it's an interesting question whether there's something unique about the psychology of pre-Christian Europeans that was important here. In this feverish rush to translate the Arabic manuscripts and to explore new trade routes around Africa, and then in this scientific revolution itself, this greedy lust for new knowledge, I almost see the psychology of those rapacious, polytheistic pagan barbarians, and you wonder, is something more going on here? Is there some reason why Europe was exactly the right place for these Christian marriage rules to then have the effect they did? I don't know. I mean, you can't run the experiment again, but yeah, could there be more? Vicky Earhart asks, to whom were marriage laws addressed? Peasants did not know about them. Much of the nobility ignored them. Whose marriages are being addressed? Well, Vicky, I'd say the peasants knew about them very well. I mean, these would have been promulgated from the Pope down to the bishops and out to the churches, which probably included everybody. So I don't know. Why do you say the peasants did not know about that?
Okay, we have no viable statistics, but Martin Luther talks about the level of illiteracy of the parish priests so that would have been at the village priest, the peasant level. This stuff just didn't apply to them. They didn't care. You married somebody from your village because you never went more than 20 miles from your village in your entire life. So you had to marry locally until we got the rise of the business class in Northern Europe far after this. I don't know who, Henrich, I guess Heinrich, no, it's Henrich. These are all local synods. None of them are ecumenical councils. And I don't know what strata of society is being addressed by them. Because the nobility that ruled were still marrying off their sons and daughters for financial reasons, to create political power and dynasties. And nobody
Right up through the 20th century, as you point out.
They didn't have anything to inherit, so it didn't matter. So I don't.
You have to imagine that the peasants probably were not on the radar screens of the church as much as the landowners. However, I think oral communication is what the church is all about down at the local level. I mean, the bishop just needs to tell people orally what the rules are, and the peasants don't have to get this in writing. They just need to hear it in the ear. So I think that would be a fine way to communicate it. The church, after all, is a communication network, isn't it? You have this network from the Pope to the cardinals to the bishops to the priests and to the monasteries. And I mean, when you talk about affecting psychology is it becomes embedded in kind of common sense rules that everybody knows. Everybody knows you shouldn't marry your cousin. Your second cousin may be okay, but not your first cousin. These things just get embedded. It becomes common sense.
I don't know. In a lot of ancient cultures, you had to marry a brother or sister to keep the bloodline pure, and that's why Cleopatra ended up marrying her brothers and then bumping them off.
Sure. And we know Prince Tutankhamun's mother and father were brother and sister.
Brother and sister, yeah.
We also know that there were so-called god kings in Ireland during the Iron Age, that first or second millennium before Christ. How do we know that? Recently, a DNA analysis of a body buried during the Iron Age in Ireland shows that he was the offspring of a brother and sister, and that's all we know about him. And we also know that his tomb was very elaborate, and so in the popular scientific popular science literature, you see this guy referred to as a god king, because everywhere else in history, when we see someone who is a ruler who is the offspring of a brother and sister, he is regarded as divine or semi-divine. So yes, well, that's the whole point. Yes, people always married their cousins all through history, and certainly was going on in Europe up to about the 5th, 6th century CE. But then it starts to change, and that is weird, as Henrich points out at great length.
Nels, this is Dan. The other thing about the early churches, back in those early days, people, listened to church much more seriously, in the sense that if they threatened you with excommunication, that was really, really serious, right? Nowadays, if the church threatens you with excommunication, you probably go to another church. But in the old days, that was about the worst thing that could happen to you, would be to be excommunicated or commit some kind of very serious sin, where they would impose some very, very difficult penance. You'd have to go on a pilgrimage or something in order to be forgiven of a certain sin. And so, it was
if you are William the Conqueror, and you marry your cousin, as he did, you might be sentenced to build an abbey. And so both he and his wife had to build an abbey somewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there were often ways around these prohibitions.
Mhm.
But okay, Eric Firm is asking, could it be that what happened in the 600, 1300s was that the in-group and out-group dynamics changed? There are many stories where Scandinavian kings gave only one living option after having been converted to Christianity. I don't know what you mean by giving only one living option, Eric. Do you mean that they made all their subjects convert to Christianity on pain of death?
Yeah, there are stories of Norwegian kings sort of getting converted and then forcing most of their people to convert as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think Charlemagne did that kind of thing in the Eastern European regions where he ruled. Yeah, you have to wonder whether that kind of conversion sticks or not. But as one generation gives way to the next, and everyone, listens to the local priests, presumably it has an effect. How that would affect the in-group and out-group dynamics. Well, as Henrich points out, the work of the church was to create this kind of Christian tribe that spread across all Europe and all spoke Latin. And, at least at some level of education they did. But even uneducated people could be Christians and belong to the church. And, I haven't discussed at all the effect on commerce of trust networks and how you decide who you trust and how you decide who it's safe to do business with. And, the church and promoting ever wider networks of trust had a beneficial effect on increasing trade and commerce. So your in-group became larger and larger. I mean, maybe that's relevant to your point.
That's a good point, Nels, that the Templars and their network of houses from Western Europe all the way to the Middle East, they were also the banks where you could put your letter of credit into a Templar house in France or Germany, and you get a receipt for it. And then when you get to Jerusalem or Damascus or some other place, you can take your receipt to the local Templar and get your money. So you're not carrying your money all the way across Europe. That's a very good point.
That is a very interesting phenomenon too. Yeah. Thank you. I hadn't been aware of that institution. So it's you can see how that would foster enhanced trade. Yeah. No, that is good. Well, we've left out a whole lot in this story. Lots and lots of interesting things are going on in Europe at this time. I didn't get a chance to refer to this book I am reading right now called The Light Ages, The Surprising Story of Medieval Science. And it is just a wonderful book about how the medieval era had a great deal of fascinating things going on. I just want to make sure I covered all my slides because I didn't get a chance to refer to the Light Ages. I don't know where it is. Anyway, yes. Good.
Try slide 30. Oh, did you find it?
No. There it is. Seb Falk, The Light Ages. Yeah, down at the bottom. Very interesting book. And he mentions Roger Bacon and the Oxford calculators, among other things. Just for interesting things going on during medieval times. Okay, well, that seems to have taken care of the chat questions.
Good, okay. Are there any, I guess we have gone through all the other questions as well. Anybody else have anything else they want to add? Okay, Nels, well, thanks again for sharing your thoughts with us. If anyone out there has further comments on this evening's presentation, you can share them on our website. There's a button on the homepage to add in your comments. And my final comment is next week we shift gears a bit. Bob Dryja will give the first of 2 talks on ethics. The title of his talk is Ethics, the Common Ground Between Faith and Science. Please join us again next Wednesday evening at 6:30. Thank you all. Good night.